the topic today is the Science Communication Research Field Analysis. We have three discussants with us today, and I'm very grateful to be joined by these renowned colleagues here from the US, the UK, and Israel. Not necessarily in that order, obviously, and in alphabetical order. We have with us Professor Ayelet Baram-Tsabari from the Education, Science and Technology Department at Technion mainly in Haifa, I believe, in Israel. We have Professor Emily Dawson with us, Science and Technology Studies Department at the University College London, obviously in London in the UK, and Professor Bruce Lewenstein, Chair of the STS Department at Cornell University in the US. The plan is that I would start with an overview of, let's say, the main findings and conclusions from the field analysis, followed then by three statements by our discussants. We have agreed in advance that we would focus on 3 to 4 main topics first of all, and then we would open the discussion as soon as we can. Down there you see the overview of what I intend to share in the next, let's say, 20 minutes. As I said, I try to keep that short. First of all, the project team you have on the right-hand side. I'm not reading them all out, including the external advisors, many of whom, all of whom probably will be known here in this community as well. And not to forget our support staff. The first major component of this field analysis is a bibliometric and content analysis, which is the first time that this has been done so comprehensively. In detail here, 7 total population samples. We didn't just sample, we said, let's take every paper ever published in any of the core science communication journals, that's POS, SCX, and SciComm, almost 2,800 at the time, and all of that obviously not done automatically, but intellectually, or as some people say, manually, coded by 9 people at the time, I believe. We then added 3 highly visible journals and magazines, Nature, Science, and the Scientific American, to compare. There we already then used a search string that included 330 results, of which, interestingly enough, 73 were false positives. So papers which included science communication, but basically were about something else. All of these little details, I think, for us as social researchers are already super interesting to think about. Then there was a publication, so-called Major Works in Public Communication of Science by our colleagues Massimiliano Bucchi and Brian Trench in 2016. We also analyzed all of those 79 papers, some of which were in POS. They're obviously then not counted and analyzed the second time, goes without saying. And you see down here the results of the online survey we did among international science communication experts. I think it was 36 at the time that were surveyed, asking them which journals would be most relevant to run such a bibliometric analysis on. The first 3 are very clear. And then you have, for example, Science, Technology, Human Values, so loads of journals that should actually be included in such analysis. But then, of course, due to time and resource constraints, we started with those, but that already immediately shows that there's much further work to be done. It also shows, as you can see down here on the right-hand side, that this is a long tail phenomenon, long tail pattern. There are essentially not just those few, there are also quite a few others which are mentioned in the text in the field analysis in the study. But there are actually dozens of relevant journals, and there has been an attempt over in the US by our colleague Rick Borkelt in 2011, then he presented it in 2012, where he tried a Google Scholar analysis with search terms, and the 471 is not data points, but these are journals. So after seeing that he would have to look at almost 500 different journals, he I don't want to say gave up, but decided that there would be that a different approach would be needed. Similarly, we did look into gray literature, but obviously this is a bottomless exercise, an endless exercise, because there are tens of thousands of project reports, conference proceedings, books, and I wonder whether nowadays a blog post from, without wanting to promote it now, but just as an example, the social impact blog from the London School of Economics, which does include sometimes pieces which are possibly as valuable, I think, personal opinion here, as a paper might be. So loads of lots of content which may need to be considered as queer literature, which at the moment we have basically only scraped the surface. And this is essentially a big data challenge, at least from here, which is why we are already working on a follow-up project where we want to apply a machine learning approach. For that, you usually need some form of calibration that the machine knows what to look for. And instead of doing that manually, purely semantically with certain search strings, we want to use the manually coded data, which has well, it's a proper, let's say, social research, so it has a robust intercodal reliability score and so on. So we want to use that to calibrate the machine learning, which would make that much more reliable than starting from scratch, so to speak. And that would be both for the semantic and the keyword search being deemed insufficient. For example, our colleague Emma Weitkamp from the SciComm journal at some point wanted to look at what has been published over the last couple of years in this journal, and it's an open access journal. And then she used the self-chosen keywords by the authors and came very quickly to the conclusion that one of the best ways not to understand what's in the papers is by using self-chosen keywords by the authors. So the keyword search is insufficient as a search approach, and a purely semantic one as well, which means we need a much more sophisticated, technologically, much more sophisticated methodologically, much more involving much more effort and programming, a big data machine learning approach, which is what we're looking at later this year for the follow-up study. The content analysis then was calibrated with a randomized stratified sample of 7% of the data. These are all details which not necessarily everyone, at least not the practitioners, may be interested in, but these are important points because particularly the reliability between those, it's 9 research assistants coding it at the time here, calculated by means of Krippendorff's alpha in a nominal scale. That is important because it's for us important to know how reliable and generalizable these results are. The basic scientometric data you can see down here, those are just classically, like, of course, we would capture which journal and date with which title, which author has published what. But more than that, and that's where it becomes more content related on the right-hand side, here there are quite a number of content variables. I think it was 21 variables in total. So determining also in which context the paper was published, which topic cluster it belongs to, whether certain methods were used. For example, down here, research methods are more quant or more qual and so on. So all of these things were manually coded for and analyzed for all of these publications. But we triangulated that because we could easily see that the pure content analysis of published research papers doesn't really answer all the questions that we wanted answered, at least in this first study. So we added online surveys, did that in a semi-structured way before and after the actual bibliometric analysis with a survey with an average response rate between those two of 59%. We conducted a systematic review of grey literature, as I have just mentioned, with 55 books, mostly, I think, and publications in detail. We then ran 2 series of interviews, and all the 3 colleagues who were so kind to join me today have, of course, been part of this expert panel. A couple of others will be part of the second webinar. And there are quotes and reflections of all of those dear colleagues in the study, also in direct quotes. If I may say so, without embarrassing anyone who's present, I really think that this is an excellent selection, was an excellent selection at the time. And this represents really the diversity of the field and an excellent and an expertise in the field. So that, I think, makes the analysis of that data all the more interesting. So that's the methodology, that's how we approached it. The study came to the conclusion that there is a need for more longitudinal studies because the vast majority of those were one-off. so more on a longer time scale. There was a challenge identified that the field may need, a challenge that the field is rather fragmented in terms of disciplines and methods used and language and jargon used, and also fragmentation and the fastly changing publication pattern across the community. Whether that is a strength or a challenge may need to be discussed, but it's definitely something that seems to be typical for our field, that there are so many disciplines from which science communication draws. Third challenge there is a need for stronger analytical innovation. So the data to be analyzed, the analytical questions for the time being, and we're coming to that in a second, are often rather classic. There is a certain research dominance by the topic of public understanding of science and media studies. And you can then read in more detail as to the suggestions how that could be diversified. There is a certain disconnect between research and practice, which has been explored further, for example, in the evidence-based science communication paper and the manifesto published at Frontiers also last year, where we may need specific transfer mechanisms between scholarship and practice to bridge those gaps. A sixth challenge, the dominance of authors from North America and Europe, even though, as you may have already seen either in the blog post or in the study, this is something that has changed quite drastically in the last, particularly in the last, let's say, 10 years. In the meantime, by far, most of the publications, at least in those core journals, are from Europe. They used to be from the US, but there's still, and there is a much more diversified, let's say, a spectrum of authors in terms of affiliations across the world, but obviously the Global South is still highly underrepresented. And you can read about the numbers, the data, the statistics in detail in the study. The prevalence of male authors is notable, probably not very surprising. If you look into the history of the field and the publication, this is something that has improved, especially for the corresponding authors. But obviously there's still way more male authors than female ones. Challenge 8 as rare disciplinary context and some life science focus. That is something that, I also have a graph about that in just a second. So we wonder whether it would be a challenge to look at those disciplinary contexts which are not as obvious as climate change or climate science or biology, for example. And the ninth, the research agenda being driven by specific issues and controversies. And the 10th, significant publics missing from the science communication research. We're also going to talk about that in more detail in the comments and the discussion. Those topics up here are the ones that we thought today we would focus on first to get the discussion going with the discussants joined today. Here it comes, suggested. This is like the rare disciplinary context and some life science focus. I chose to zoom into that, so to speak, because that was, interestingly enough, what made most of the buzz on Twitter, even though I had the impression that people assumed this is about which disciplines were covered, let's say in public communication, even though this is, of course, disciplines in the focus of a science communication researcher, which is fundamentally different, obviously. Nonetheless, as you can see here, the tweets from physicists, and I think we had the earth sciences at some point on Twitter saying, this graph says everything. But again, this is not about coverage of scientific disciplines, but about us as social researchers looking at science communication, looking at specific disciplines. It should be said that no discipline down there includes all disciplines. For example, many and most, you see that from the inferential analysis in the study, most theory papers obviously don't focus on physics or mathematics, but then they are no or any discipline, so to speak. So that was quite surprising, as it seems, to the community. Also interesting that the focus on biology, life sciences in general, which most of us in the field are aware of or were aware of, has even increased to a significant extent. This could be here, particularly with environmental sciences and ecology due to climate science and climate change mitigation, adaptation, and so on. But that, of course, now involves quite a bit of speculation. There are a couple of research gaps that the study has identified together with its expert panel. We said there are 4 main clusters of gaps. The first one, the information behavior is changing and the way attitudes form in an increasingly digitalized media system. Those systemic changes in that digitalized environment, increasingly digitalized environment, are not yet sufficiently understood. There is, of course, quite a lot of research also on digital media. Whether that necessarily always takes place in the science communication domain is maybe also something one may want to discuss. Second research gap cluster, so to speak, was about rapidly changing media systems. So the one kind of course, feeding into the other, and the fact that digitization brings about not only new means and tactics of communication, but even entirely new actors. So that could be about disintermediation and re-intermediation and automated tools and bots and things like that. So I think we're all witnessing change of these systems to speed, which none of us may have anticipated quite a while, even just a while ago. The third cluster of research gaps would be the evaluation of policy impacts. So how to measure and how to compare the impact that our communication has on science and innovation policy, including here, I suppose, the regulation of new technologies, for example, statutory regulation that would be considered another important research gap. So again, to understand how all of that hangs together. Fourth cluster of research gaps, the communication governance dimension. So research funders, the RFOs, which are increasingly expecting or even requiring specific forms of communication as part of their funding and or assessing whether that communication then has happened, whether that's in the proposals as a deciding factor in the evaluation of a proposal or in the assessment of the research results. All of those are governance issues, the way an organization deals with it, the priorities and the objectives derive from that. So that was another fourth element which the study thought would be under-researched. Coming to the concrete recommendations, and looking at the time, I think I need to wrap up soon as well. The main 8 research recommendations were: we need topics beyond PUS and media studies. We need more longitudinal studies, and we need more experimental research. We need to involve more specific publics and actors, so not just general audiences or general public. One of the specific publics, for instance, was the science communication practitioners themselves, whether we should have more research on that. The fourth research recommendation, specific disciplines outside the life and environmental sciences, as mentioned just now, to develop theoretical foundations further. So there was also the clear analysis and resulting recommendation that we don't necessarily have the theoretical corpus that we may need as to emerge and to be a field in its own right, that we need to encourage a more diverse mix of research methods and the use of new tools. And that, for example, here would then include big data analysis, AI, and so on. We would have to have an increasingly horizontal systems research approach instead of having more vertical, like looking into specific applications or case studies, cross-sectional studies, or more horizontal systems approach that interconnects those different aspects, and to foster increasingly international collaboration, which isn't just limited due to language barriers and cultural barriers, but as it seems also disciplinary traditions. If I may just zoom quickly into research recommendation number 6, because again, it's been something that has been quite intensively discussed on social media in the last few weeks. This is about the variety of methods being used. My spontaneous reaction back then, I remember that sitting and looking at the screen when the colleagues presented those preliminary results. I was wondering whether that was a historical analysis or whether that was from today's perspective, particularly when you see that there has been, apart from looking at databases, that there has been actually insignificant change. So it is actually, our field still works mostly with surveys. It's mostly survey-based. Then come interviews, and then participatory observation or observational techniques, focus groups. So none of this is necessarily particularly innovative. I'm not saying that it's, I think none of us were saying that it's by definition insufficient or inappropriate, but it certainly shows that there is not necessarily a large amount of innovation and of willingness to explore new ways of analyzing things. And finally, we also made policy recommendations, because how would things otherwise change? The building of a science communication research corpus with effective transfer mechanisms between scholarship and practice. And that is not unidirectional transfer. As far as I understand, Ayelet will reflect on that much further, but it's supposed to be bidirectional, an exchange, which also would include anticipating and trying to understand what the research requirements are, the research needs in the practitioners' community. Second policy recommendation was to establish well-resourced science communication research hubs. That has already happened in some countries, with our Australian friends, for example. At ANU, there's a large research hub. We have Cornell with us. So there are a couple of exceptions, but in most countries that we looked at, actually there is a rather, let's say, very diverse structure. One colleague sitting here, 2 colleagues sitting there in different institutions, and that sometimes seems to have given the impression of them not being necessarily able to leverage a critical mass of visibility and so on. So, whereas normally in other research areas, you would have some strong research hubs. This is not a thing in science communication, at least not globally. Whether that is necessarily a good or a bad thing, again, is something we may want to discuss, because it could also potentially lead to mainstreaming, I suppose. The third policy recommendation would be about increasing internationalization and inclusion of global perspectives, because, well, I suppose it's rather self-explaining, self-explanatory that unfortunately the European and the Australian and the Indian and the Japanese science communication research to a large extent focus on their specific challenges and solutions and contexts and policies, whereas a comparative understanding of what's going on in the world, mutual learning between the different systems across language and cultural barriers, I think would be something that's that what also the study concluded would be a great opportunity. Okay, so much for the overview of the results. I guess I first of all stop sharing screens, because then the plan would be to start with our discussants.
So first off, as I begin, I want to note that today in the United States is the day that we celebrate the birthday of Martin Luther King, highlighting the importance of civil rights and human rights. And I also want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from within the traditional homelands of the Cayuga Nation, which are part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with both historic and contemporary presence on the land that I'm sitting on. And that presence precedes the establishment of the city of Ithaca, Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. Now, I give these acknowledgements not just as a matter of current political correctness, but because they remind us that our conversations about science communication are actually are embedded in much larger conversations about the kind of world that we want to live in. And so it's important for us to think about these things. I want to thank Alex and his team, both for the original project itself and then for their openness to the conversation, the fact that they've really put a lot of work into making, first off, the report itself accessible in a variety of formats, including audio, posting summaries of it, the manifesto in the journal Frontiers, and so on. I'm also very conscious that the report is building on previous work. Alex just mentioned a few minutes ago the work by Rick Borchelt that did a sort of Google analysis. There was also the articles that Martin Bauer and Susan Howard from the journal Public Understanding of Science did, looking at the changes in that journal. I think especially of a survey somewhat similar, although a little bit more limited, but to what Alex and his team have done by Lars Gunther and Marina Joubert, and published in SciComm a few years ago. So this is an ongoing conversation that we're having about what this field is and what it means to be a field. I think it's an important conversation seen by the incredible diversity of people on this participants list that we're seeing, those of you on this webinar. It's really amazing to see so many people. And it's in that context that I want to talk about what the report calls Grand Challenge 2, the issue of fragmentation. And there's a real tension here between the idea that we're trying to somehow create something more coherent, but at the same time, as Alex just said, there's all kinds of gaps. There's all kinds of places that we haven't gotten to. And so I want to think about that issue. Now, I'm a historian originally, so my instinct is to look at this historically, and especially to think about whether using the term science communication is really the right way to even do the examination of what our field is. The analysis in this report begins around 1979 with the journal that's now called Science Communication, but in fact, at that time was called Knowledge. It was when it was created in 1979, it was called Knowledge, Creation, Diffusion, Utilization. And that title alone tells you that there was a very specific model there. It was a one-way model. Knowledge was here, and then it was created and diffused and utilized, very much counter to the kind of model that we have today, where we think about two-way or multi-way engagement. And in fact, that's why the editor, the outgoing editor, Marcel Lafollette, and the incoming editor, Carol Rogers, in the mid-90s, changed the name to Science Communication, was to capture more than the knowledge vision. But even then, they did not think of science communication as just public communication of science. For them, science communication included all kinds of other issues of science policy and communication. Actually, the very first item they listed was called communication among researchers and within the science community. And that's not what most of us who are on this webinar are primarily interested in. So I'm a little concerned sometimes that when we use the shorthand of science communication, and especially if we use that as a search term for trying to do an analysis of our field, that creates a problem. Now, there's already been a question that was either in the chat or the Q&A about whether we're trying to somehow, whether we have a goal of creating a more coherent kind of label, and I think that's a challenge. I think some of the terms that we need to think about, I mean, on the one hand, I don't want to get caught in terminology. On the other hand, I think it is worth paying attention to the fact that when I started in this field and my hair was nowhere near as gray as it is now, you know, I was interested in what was then called public understanding of science. And the other terms were popularization. And then there's the recurring term of science literacy. And the question about other languages then comes up, because what do we do with vulgarisation in French, or divulgation in Spanish, or culture scientifique again, in French, or appropriation sociale in Spanish again. These terms have different meanings. And I think we have to pay attention to those different meanings because they capture different elements of our field, which don't all fit together smoothly. I think there's real value. There's been a quick discussion in the Q&A already about the term engagement, whether we're talking about political engagement or educational engagement, which have different meanings. And my concern is that if we try too hard to create a coherence, we're going to lose some of the richness that comes from all of that. Just another way that language is interesting here, especially given the shift in that journal title from knowledge to science communication, is, and the question has already come up again in the chat and the Q&A, is the focus in English, which is particularly noticeable since this report was produced in Germany, although I realize it's an English-speaking university. But about 20 years ago, the sociologist Peter Weingart and his colleague Petra Panzergrau published an article in Public Understanding of Science about what was called the Goldhagen Debate, which was a debate in Germany about how to produce knowledge and understand the Holocaust around before and during World War II. So it was essentially an article about history. And I was at the time the editor of the journal, and I had remember this conversation that I had with Peter, asking him Professor Weingart, why was he insisting that we should publish this article in our journal? Because we were a Public Understanding of Science journal. He said, you're wrong. Your problem is you're thinking in English. You should be thinking in German, because Wissenschaft and science are interchangeable there. So language matters, and I think that that's a real challenge for us as we think about the field. A second big issue that we have, and again, it's already recognized both in Alex's comments and in the chat, is that earlier version of research was very limited. Again, from the opening editorial in the journal Knowledge, studies of knowledge have a very long intellectual tradition, which is reflected throughout Western civilization. The intellectual fathers of the field, and then it goes on to list all the great names of Aristotle and Plato and Comte and Karl Marx and Max Weber. And that's clearly limiting, right? That's one of the issues that we are so very aware of, the ways in which that has limited our understanding of the world. It's already come up in the chat, the links to Lindy Ortia's work and her colleagues, Emily, who we'll hear from in a couple of minutes, her work on thinking about people who have not traditionally had access. And so, I think that reinforces the point that the current literature is too limited, but it also raises the question is, if we expand out even further, how are we going to create a coherent whole? And I think that becomes a real challenge. Part of that challenge is that we do all come from such very different places, right? Emily and Ayelet both come from an education world. Alex comes from a corporate institutional communication world. I come out of history of science. If we start looking at those of you who are practitioners who are out here in the webinar, we have people who are science journalists, science museum people who are community activists, people who work within institutions, people who are challenging institutions. I think that's one of the wonderful things about our field is we have this vibrancy, we have such variety, but that also makes it, for me, question whether we should be spending the time to create this coherent whole. Now, one of the problems, of course, is that there are things that this collection of people have learned, right? With perhaps the most basic one being that we know that trust turns out to be at least as important, if not more so, than facts. And that's troubling to all of us who worry about misinformation. That's troubling to all of us who think that part of why we love science is because it gives us some kind of reliable knowledge about the world. But we are also dealing with a world of our colleagues who don't yet have that understanding and who just say, you know, just show me how to get my point across and to get my facts across. And so there is that basic knowledge that we wish we could get more people to understand, and yet we have this incredibly diverse world. And so this is the tension, I think, between trying to find the coherent field and having this broader field. The pandemic makes this clear. Again, I think the question came up already in the chat. Is science communication, does it include risk and environment and health communication, or are those separate fields? I have a running joke with my colleagues here at Cornell that science communication includes risk, environment, and health. And my risk communication people say risk communication includes science, environment, and health. And the health communication people say that includes science, environment, and risk, right? All these things, are they separate or are they the same? How do we think about this? So I think the grand challenge that we have is not to reduce fragmentation, but rather to figure out how to deal with fragmentation in a way that gives us some kind of core, but nonetheless recognizes this great diversity. And again, to come back to that land acknowledgement that I gave at the beginning, for us to recognize that these conversations that bring us together here today are part of these much larger conversations that we can't hope to bring into a single conversation. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bruce. So I think, Emily, we agreed that you would be second. Is that right? Or am I mistaken? Okay. Emily Dawson, University College London.
Hi, everyone. It's so lovely to see you all. And just as an aside, first of all, obviously, I'm very sorry for the outrageous things I say in reports and interviews and will probably say today. And second of all, it's really nice to talk to grown-ups for the afternoon. That's really lovely. I'm very excited about it. So I suppose I wanted to say so many things and have obviously not had a huge amount of time to prepare. I suppose drawing on what Bruce has said, my wonderful colleague, Uma Patel, regularly talks about the author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's point that there is no one story about anything. So I'm in full agreement really with Bruce that we cannot have one story about whatever we call this stuff, science communication or otherwise. And certainly in thinking then about, Alex asked me to talk about the sort of lack of diversity in research and topics, so theories, topics, focuses. And I suppose one thing that I was thinking and scribbling when I was listening was, I don't really want to unify the field, and I never really have, but where does that come from and what am I thinking about? And part of that is how we get disciplined. And a lot of the ways that I think we have some struggles in science communication research that you can see in the report that Alex and his team have done, is that Bourdieu has a nice quote about it, but basically we don't look outside the box. So we don't perhaps ever fully understand the shape of the box or what we're missing by not looking outside of that box. So in that sense, it's very limiting. And some of the things I wanted to run through were how we might think about that. So if you look at the report, you see this extraordinary continuing focus on print media, which, forgive me, I wrote boring, easy next to it. But partly that's, I do it, don't get me wrong, it's fully judgmental. But the conversation there is about, there's a lot of useful things to learn from that. We still need to look at media framing. We'll always need to look at adverts. And we have to understand how these things operate. But there's so much more to think about. But these are relatively straightforward data sets to get hold of, and they're relatively straightforward to look at. So when we start to think then about, the tragic lack of longitudinal work, which is obviously partly a funding issue, but it's also because these things are so much harder to do, so they require more money, they require bigger teams, and then we don't get that knowledge, that information as we go through it. So the kinds of long-term work that we see are based on individuals building then for a long time on a string of projects run together, which is amazing, but that means somebody has to be in that job for a long time and they're able to garner that kind of research trajectory. So after being horrible initially, the sorts of things I wondered if we might start to see more constructively is if you look at the what is also called a multidiscipline of science and technology studies that some parts of science communication sit within, we start to see clear strands of work around things like disability studies or CRIP studies, around queer studies, around feminist studies, around Black feminist studies, and around critical race theory. So I started to think through on syllabuses that I run, because obviously I'm an academic and teach, but there are there's work that I use in modules around CRIP studies and infrastructure studies by people like Amy Hamray. There's work on Indigenous SciComm and cultural sovereignty from people like Kim Tallbear, Summer May Finley, and also Lindy Orthea. There's some quite interesting queer SciComm coming out, and I'm thinking about work on risk and communication by people like Kane Race, but also increasingly some of the affect theory that I think speaks to the issues that Bruce pointed to about trust. And there's some really interesting work coming out around that I think you could call critical race studies science communication. If you look at, for instance, the work of Sophia Imogen-Noble on Google and Black feminism. So where we start to think perhaps more broadly and pull in those more, that kind of broader, more reflective group of theories, where we're not perhaps just looking, as the recent papers that critique a narrow historic approach have said, we're not just looking at a particular form of communication in a particular part of the world from a particular perspective. I think that's really enriching, and I think also, importantly, from the kinds of work I do, really speaks to more people as well and can give us some more and more useful ways to think about working with people who might not usually be involved in science communication. I went on a short, and Ayelet, it's not that long, I promise, a short review of what I thought we might think about in terms of people. And I think where we perhaps limit ourselves with a focus on surveys and also with a focus on news articles or print media is perhaps where do we then think about the more complicated person-centered research approaches and how we might think then about that, specifically in terms of those approaches that I work within, where we think about what reparative social justice might look like, for instance, or what inclusive, equitable, and equal approaches might look like. And I'm thinking here, well, let me come back to that. So I was thinking, what about people? And I was thinking here about, there's a wonderful book by someone called Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, called The Dark Fantastic, which I highly recommend everyone read. And it's a fun read. It's not like my book, it's a fun read. And she's talking there about in darkened publics, and she's talking about the lack of, well, rather the representational problems around racism in young adult and teen science fiction and fantasy books. And I was reading it thinking this applies really well to how we think about publics and science communication. And so when we think about people then, there's clear groups that we work with again and again and again. And I'm thinking in the kinds of work I do, people that already go to museums. They're really well researched. We know quite a lot about them. But we don't know about all of these other publics. So what might they be then? So for Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, maybe they are in darkened publics. Or I've sometimes used the word shadow publics, which has a clear racialized connotation. But we might also think about invisibilized publics, ignored publics, marginalized publics, and oppressed publics. And the problem then, as far as our work goes, is that if we don't think in broad terms about who we're working with and why, we are contributing then to rendering specific publics invisible, and that is obviously problematic. And by problematic, to be clear, I mean it would be racist, sexist, classed, homophobic, heteronormative, ableist, and so on. So why do we have this problem? Well, part of that problem is that, as the wonderful Jane Gregory once put it to me, science communication, she believes, and I can see her sense here, is somewhat a refugee discipline. So often people come from other backgrounds, whether that is in the sciences or whether that is in the history or philosophy of science or something like science education. So then to think about what you might need to know to do science communication often is the preserve of people, again, no offense, who've had a wonderful and illustrious career in chemistry and at a particular point in their professorship have moved to be in science communication. Now, that doesn't necessarily give us the kinds of tools we might want to think critically about what science communication is doing, however we want to call it. So then we might have researchers, as we have seen in many cases, from the more dominant backgrounds of their particular societies. And then if we think about doing research beyond working already with dominant groups, people have complained to me time and time again that it is time consuming, that it is scary, and that they almost cannot think about going beyond what we might call the usual suspects. And so I'm thinking here about the work of Professor Linda Toohey-Smith, who writes about the idea of de-colonial methodologies. And her point here is we perhaps don't have the staff capacity to support researchers from different backgrounds. And we don't know how to ask the right questions, and we don't even really know enough to think that we might not know how to ask the right questions. And so we get stuck in these kind of multiple sort of binds. So one of the things that I want to think about from publics is something I've been thinking about really a lot, so forgive me. But I'm thinking about Fred Moten's work on fugitive studies and what then the fugitive or underground or undercommons publics for science communication might look like, versus, for instance, a more orthodox or dominant or visible public. So then we might think about the grassroots publics, the activist networks, the community education projects, the community citizen science projects. But we might also think about the more underground or fugitive publics. And I'm thinking here about the authors and readers of / fan fiction, the community grassroots citizen science groups who are never interested in working with universities or policymakers. They're doing what they want under their own terms, and they don't want or need that link out. And then I'm thinking, I suppose, also about the more, the less institutionalized maker and hacker practices that we see around the world. And especially as that works then, when we start to think about the place of science and culture and the idea then of subcultural practices and how we respect, recognize and value them, or how we perhaps continue to overlook them by being quite narrow in our focus. So thinking about that, another thing I thought I would do is just list names of people, but I'm not going to do that because I can do that in the chat and send links to people's work. But there are, of course, amazing people doing much, okay, not that sentence, amazing people doing some very interesting research in science communication that we can all read and learn more from. And I can put links to that in the chat afterwards. And I thought I would finish by saying, I know it came up in one of the questions, but in some of my work, I have kind of, what's the word, ended up using the term everyday science or everyday science learning. The kinds of people that I work with, which are grassroots community groups, often self-organized, often have had to be, have a long-term relationship built up in order to bother to do research because they don't necessarily see the value in it. They don't recognize science communication. They don't recognize the weird small niche field that we all know and love. And they don't even recognize the bigger fields of science education or science and technology studies or museums and art galleries. So then to think about how we meet science in everyday life and how people engage with science in this less, rather starting from their perspective rather than starting from our perspective, I think offers a lot of value to how we might take science communication forward. And now I'll stop.
What a shame to thank you for stopping, perfectly continuing also, I think, on Bruce's reasoning. So it's as if we had planned it. It's great. Thank you very much indeed. Oh, she's not hearing me anymore. Anyway, I say that without witness. Thank you very much indeed, Emily, for that reflection. I just said thank you very much indeed. We're proceeding, I think, directly to Ayelet. Baram-Tsabari has joined us today from Israel, I suppose. And in the interest of time, with no further ado, over to you.
Well, okay, so first of all, good evening from Tel Aviv, and thank you for having me. And second, I'm really happy to talk after Bruce and Emily because I can completely disagree with their approach without them being able to answer, at least until the open discussion, and maybe we won't have time for the open discussion, and then that's it. So without further ado, as you say, I was happy to take on Grand Challenge 3, identified by the report. To remind you, this Grand Challenge speaks of the lack of transfer between scholarship and practice within the science communication community. You said neither takes sufficient notice of the other's priorities, challenges, and solutions. And I think it's rightfully stated. In the 9 minutes or so I have left, I would like to argue for the responsibility of the research community to this situation. I'll talk about the responsibility of the research community, but it is the easiest to start with the practitioners. It's true that many practitioners are reinventing wheels or continue doing what was always been done without educating themselves about theoretical and empirical development in their own craft. Some of them seem to think that evidence-based decision-making is something they should preach to the public, but not something to inform their own practice. The words of Handelsman to scientists who are teaching in universities, I think, are fitting here as well. Why do outstanding scientists who demand rigorous proof for scientific assertions in their research continue to use and indeed defend, on the basis of their intuition alone, teaching methods that are not the most effective? Indeed, why do science communicators, some of them, continue to use engagement methods that research is so critical about? Well, an important contribution of research to practice could be theory-based success criteria, evidence-based standards, and validated, reliable research tools for public engagement with science and for scientist training in science communication. However, the research community seems reluctant to study and publish such works. One issue is that journals in our field don't like to publish papers on validation of new research tools, if not accompanied by empirical results of an additional study. For example, in your report, Professor Diatrom-Scheufel is quoted saying, "The stuff we have the most difficulty publishing is stuff with a practical focus, compared to something that has theory that is recognized." True as it is, to me, this is the minor issue. I think the real problem is ideological. Practitioners care a lot about the impact of their activities. Impact is an open and abstract term that is tightly controlled by the goals of the activity. But after decades of science communication outreach, engagement, and participation actions, and studies looking at these processes and outcomes, I would expect that if one knows the goal, knows the target audience, knows the method of engagement, one should have a pretty good idea on the potential expected impact and how to measure it. At least, one should have a pretty good idea on what would be considered success based on decades of international experience, and we do not have that. Many researchers are not interested in practical questions. They prioritize clean research methods over useful ecological and valid outcomes, and they see their contribution in problematizing theoretical constructs over saying something useful. Nothing makes some people, I don't mention anyone here, but nothing makes some people happier than to point that in public engagement with science, there is no consensus on what is science, what is engagement, or what is public. While blurring concepts might be a fun activity in STS conferences, it is not very helpful for practice. I follow David Clark in saying that precise and shared definitions are essential for sharing and comparing experiences and making progress. Actionable definitions are essential for building research practice partnerships on the disciplinary level. Many science communication researchers would, frown now and say that each and every case study is a unique contextualized snowflake that cannot be measured on a scale that was developed for another activity in another place. But such an approach makes it practically impossible to test and rate effectiveness of different approaches with different audiences. No wonder practitioners shy away from such an unhelpful attitude for their, for what they need. The research report accounts for more reasons for this research practice disconnect. For example, the fact that most publications are still behind paywalls and thus have even technically unavailable for many practitioners. However, the report notes even if more research results were publicly available, practitioners worldwide, based on surveys from the US, UK, and Germany, are mostly not willing or interested in taking the initiative to work their way through the publications. In Germany, a representative survey showed that hardly any practitioners know, let alone use, scholarly journals. And this might well be the case in other non-English speaking countries. Now, language and academic vocabulary are not the only, not even the most important factor in making science communication scholarship worthwhile reading for practitioners. But I would like to elaborate on this point as well, based on a recent research we had in Public Understanding of Science. As you might know, Public Understanding of Science is an interdisciplinary journal aiming to serve both the scholarly community and practitioners. So what we did was to analyze the readability and jargon in articles published in Public Understanding of Science throughout the 3 decades, almost 3 decades it exists. And we looked at papers from 1999-2000, 2009, and 2019. And we assessed them in terms of readability and jargon. To make a long analysis short, we found that the readability decreased and use of jargon increased between the first decade and the following decade. It was true for empirical and non-empirical papers and for all parts, including the abstract. But what I want to show you is a figure. Let's see if I can do this. So we looked only at the rare words and we cleaned all the words that are, academic vocabulary. And we were left with a list of words that were rare and not academic, general academic vocabulary. And what you can see on panel A are words that many, more than 5 papers, more than 5 articles used in 2019. And I think you know these words, and some of them are really expected, like popularization and technoscientific. But on panel B, you see words that were used in only 1 article. So we can't call it like a disciplinary jargon. We can call it, people talking with themselves. And I think what we can see here are words that on average appeared on 1.4 articles, and the median was 1. So that's not a lot. I think what we can see here that public understanding of science has moved away from everyday language. Now, this does not mean it is incomprehensible to its scholarly readership, but it may have consequences to other audiences, such as practitioners. Research practice partnerships between science communication scholars and practitioners may present benefits for practice by inspiring publics, promoting understanding of science, and engaging publics more deliberately in science-based, on the best evidence available. It may also advance science communication research through the development, use, and evaluation of evidence-based approach to the practice of communicating with people about science, if to quote the Standing Committee on Advancing Science Communication Research and Practice. But these beneficial outcomes might be hampered if science communication practitioners do not identify themselves as an audience for science communication scholarship. And I think that this is the grand challenge we have, that on the one hand, many scientists are not really interested in the challenges and the interest and the needs of the practitioners, and even have ideological reasons for doing so, not just fundraising or interest. And on the other hand, many of the practitioners do not identify themselves as readership for such research. So thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ayelet. Thank you. Thanks to all 3 of you. One of the early questions that was asked was about global diversity of the interviewed experts. As far as I could see, that has already been answered live by Julia Loker, thankfully, the colleague who had helped to coordinate the project back then. The list of experts is also printed at the end of the book for those who want to see it. There was a question about language. Indeed, at the moment, we're talking about English language publications regarding the bibliometric analysis, but since there was a global distribution of experts on the panel, then of course there were also reflections from Latin America and the African continent and Asia Pacific region and so on. I think the most popular question at the moment, at least a minute ago, and feel free to keep posting under the Q&A function of Zoom, the most popular question, if that's a way to put it, is the one about the role of RFOs, the research funding organizations, kind of follow the money question. Interesting enough coming from the UK, but that just as a side sentence. What role do funders play in influencing or supporting the sustainability of the research and its quality and breadth? So the role of research funding organizations in influencing or even supporting the sustainability of the research, the quality of the research, the breadth of the research. May I ask if any of the three colleagues want to go first? Anyone feel inclined? Bruce?
I'm glad to. I'll give a chance for the others to jump in if they want. But so the United States is a little bit different this way than many other countries in that we have a much bigger reliance on private philanthropy than many countries where much more of the funding comes through government agencies. And here there's been a recent alliance of several of the major NGO funding foundations, which are particularly concerned about the research practice issue and about trying to find ways of connecting the research to the audiences, and they have much more representation from those audiences, the way Ayelet requested. So I think there's some potential there. I'm thinking particularly of the Civic Fellows program that the Rita Allen Foundation is organizing, and various initiatives from the Kavli Foundation. What I think is interesting in terms of our thinking about what the problems are, and this gets, I think, to things that both Emily and Ayelet said, is that our research on what this field is based on research. We did not, you talked to Alex a little bit about the difficulty of analyzing the gray literature, but we don't have the analyses of the newsletter of the National Association of Science Writers, or the newsletter of the American Association of Museums, or the Association of Science Technology Centers. What are the questions that are being asked there? And how can those of us in the research community respond to those questions rather than to our own, as Ayelet would put it, theoretically, going off into the area. This is a conversation Ayelet and I have had for 15 years. So whether those of us in STS are not properly connected to the research community, to the practice community. But anyway, I think that we probably should spend more time looking at the publications and the places where practitioners talk in order to find our questions.
Yeah, maybe I can come in very quickly about that point, because it relates also very well to the UAC paper, the evidence-based SciComm paper, which made exactly that point. And by analyzing the research that has been done, and by having researchers reflect on what has been done and what should be done, we have not assessed the research needs by those who were supposedly, at least indirectly, serving, as Ayelet explains, in improving practice in terms of making it more efficient, making it more effective. That means, I think what is required would be a systematic analysis of those needs, which isn't a researcher field analysis, but which is a needs analysis. So kind of an active listening exercise within the practitioners community. And that would need to be facilitated in terms of, we need probably conferences, specific mechanisms, interviews to find out what is being needed. And I mean, we are speculating in the report, the expert panel is speculating basically that probably there's a significant disconnect between what is needed in day-to-day practice in running a science center, organizing science festival, in informal and non-formal STEM education, what have you, and whatever is being researched in the field. And in addition to those being disconnected, be what Ayelet mentioned, but I think it's important maybe to underline that it's also that could be and should maybe be done increasingly together as an action research approach, that it's not there's the research and that needs to be applied, or there's the question that needs to be answered, but and there's also, Bruce, in the US now, a funding scheme, I think they're called tandem schemes, where you have a practitioner and a scholar who together apply for a grant, and then they're addressing something that immediately feeds into being implemented and being tested, piloted in practice. That should have been long enough to give Emily and or Ayelet the opportunity.
Well, I think, Ayelet, do you want to jump in? I can wait.
I'm still waiting for any governmental funding for my research area, so unless it's coming, I don't have an answer.
So I think here in the UK, it's been really interesting to watch research for science communication, and then what we sometimes call informal science learning kind of emerge and then disappear and emerge and disappear. And it seems to be, at the moment, I'm seeing a lot of disappearing happening because people have got other priorities, which I can understand, but it's obviously a concern. And I am always very jealous, Bruce, of the US National Science Foundation ASIL funding stream. But I think, I mean, Ayelet, I suppose I'm always shocked that we've managed to get any research done with any money from anywhere. And a lot of the research, and this also speaks to some of that fragmentation and some of the patterns in the kinds of research being done, is that when it's being done yourself, because you managed to get a summer student funded for 4 weeks, and then in the meantime it's your own favorite project, so you do it on the weekends, that's a really difficult way to do research, obviously. And that then speaks to why we are going down certain roads, because they're more accessible, they're easier to manage to do in what is otherwise a very busy life, just trying to get research done. So I think there are some issues around. I mean, obviously, I'm sure we would all love to see sustained research tracks for science communication practice and research. That would be a delight, but I've yet to see anything on the cards particularly.
So maybe I misrepresented our funding schemes. Now I understand that. At the moment, there is in Israel, no specific funding scheme for science communication. I think as I told Bruce a few years ago, we didn't have a term for that in Hebrew until a few years ago. So it's not something that is being funded specifically, but the ISF, which is, like the NSF, and just poor, is of course also accepting proposals about these issues. And the universities helps us with fellowships for students. So it's not as bad as I might have suggested. What I meant to say is that it's not recognized as a track that should be funded like other disciplines.
The conversations then about a field, you can also read in light of the field wanting to be recognizable. So there's a degree of self-interest there in terms of if we would like to be recognized for funding, for practice and for research, or for posts, or for studentships. That's where being an emerging field, becoming a more developed field, and having those bits of terminology arguments battered out. I mean, I guess I'm saying you can see our self-interest in those discussions.
Yeah, I mean, it could be a fairly legitimate self-interest, if you want, because we want our field, I suppose, to grow and to be more relevant and to be more useful. I mean, in addition to the praxis, as we may call what we've just been discussing, I think the funding of mainly PhD studentships of these 3-year, 4-year cycles of projects, which sounds long, but everyone who's done any of these, let's say Horizon 2020 projects, for example, knows how fast they're finished before you've started collecting the data. The eligibility question that, for example, if you have a European research grant, then many of the presumably rich countries are excluded because they are, by definition, competitors. So having a US partner in a European project and vice versa is, at least let's put it like that, a grant proposal challenge. And all of these and many more factors in research funding have a direct influence on how longitudinal studies can be and also on how comparative they can be, because comparative, not comparing the results at the end, but having a research design that enables us to compare things at the end. And we thought about this at the beginning, which means we would have the same measurement instruments being applied in Argentina and in Indonesia and in Nigeria and in Sweden. Yeah? And then you can compare, but that would require a funding organization which would be willing to be acting as globally as that. Looking at the disciplinary graph that I showed earlier, with life sciences being very often studied and certain other disciplines not, the colleague here, Jena Barjas-Lichtenstein, is wondering if the low representation of mathematics is due in part to the exclusion of particular journals from this study. For example, was numeracy included? There is a fair amount of math communication research published there. I'd be curious to hear more about this. None of us is a mathematician, but whoever feels inclined to comment. You're not being tested on your numeracy as part of your answer.
I'm happy to jump in. I think we have a similar problem when we talk about STEM. And for instance, one of our projects, we really have not talked about engineering in that. So I think it becomes quite difficult, and it depends what perspective you're taking. I can't speak to Alex's study, but for instance, in our studies, we have over the years defaulted to what our participants, which are typically young people working in community spaces, what they think science is, which then also leads you down a bit of a tricky road about what is science, what isn't science. But I think certainly that division between STEM to science to STEM with a double M to include medicine, or STEAM to include art, it makes it quite, it's quite difficult sometimes to draw the lines between those things. And then I suppose the question becomes, from our work, do we need to or want to draw those lines? We often try not to.
Yeah, I see Ayelet nod. Any further comments about disciplines in general, or specific disciplines being potentially underrepresented? Also in the journal context, of course, I mentioned it in the beginning, maybe the colleague wasn't there when we went through the methodology part, that obviously there are not dozens, but several hundred journals out there. Like if you have the British Medical Journal, which also publishes actually really interesting science communication pieces of research from time to time.
I think we also have to recognize that, I think the question about mathematics is correct, and the chemists have in their own journals publish many things, the physicists do, and so on. So I think, again, this is the challenge of this attempt to define a field, is that we have such diversity, and then how do we create some kind of core without losing the richness of that diversity?
I think it would be great if the major journals in science communication, like Bibliometric Understanding of Science and Science Communication, would have a practitioner's abstract, as well as academic abstract. I think not to put it in lay terms, because practitioners are definitely not lay people, but to put it into a practitioner's framing and get the researchers to think about what does that mean for practice. I think it would be helpful, and of course these abstracts should be free to use, and usually people don't really need to read 8,000 words. Usually 200 are enough. If they find that the 200 are really interesting, they will contact the researcher and get whatever tools they were using. And I think that would be beneficial for both the practitioners, who would see the breadth and richness of research, and maybe gain some ideas for their own professional development. But it's always also very, very relevant for the researchers to help them stay relevant.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's a fundamentally important first step. It's a long way that we need to go as a community. In the interest of time, I think we should probably wrap up unless Ayelet and Bruce, you disagree. Maybe I'll try to summarize just quickly a few points, but we have also saved both the Q&A function and the chat, and we'll possibly try to address some of the answers, some of the questions afterwards. So, I mean, the idea of today was, first of all, to explore those strengths and weaknesses of the research field, the trends and perspectives of what has been called a refugee discipline. I love that. As that beast was framed, the beast of snowflakes, to make the imagery complete. Ayelet then reminded us just now of the shared responsibilities, that these are shared responsibilities in, first of all, the community choosing research topics and methods, and the responsibility in practitioners using and applying and even demanding specific evidence that they may need, and then collaborating on that. While there is a great need for validated tools, we also pointed out that work on those tools is extremely difficult to publish in the established journals, which seems to be a very obvious flaw in the system, something that could probably be addressed quite easily. Bruce Lewenstein reminded us of the importance of terminologies and ontologies, I should probably add, and their meanings, leading to the warning that a focus on coherence, which seems obvious when talking about the diversity of those terminologies, a focus on coherence in science communication may come at the price of losing the diversity which we witness at the moment if we simply reduce it. Unless, but you nodded, I seem to have represented you reasonably accurately. And Emily Dawson, who already had to leave us just now, followed up by emphasizing that the mere attempt to unify disciplines could have a remarkable disciplining effect to the community, which may also be something that we may not want. Emily therefore reminded us of the risks that our own lack of reflexivity in the scientific community regarding the diversity of our research design may actually potentially foster the marginalization of those, which I think she called shadow publics. Having said that, there shall be a recording of the session for all of those who missed the beginning or had to leave earlier. I'll follow up with links regarding the recording and regarding the study and so on. Thanks as well to everyone who has obviously contributed to it, to all the other experts, to the colleagues who made it happen, the study. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, thank you.
Bye, Bruce. Ciao, Ayelet. Thanks so much.